Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever wondered why the kindest people, those who love the deepest, give the most, and endure the longest, suddenly go silent after narcissistic abuse? Why they disappear into their homes, shut their doors, and slip into a quiet the world doesn't understand? Tonight, I want to tell you something powerful, that silence is not a collapse. It is a comeback. It is the moment an empath stops bleeding for the wrong person and starts breathing for themselves. Stay with me, because once you understand what happens in that silence, you'll never see empaths, or their strength, the same way again. Silence is often misunderstood, especially when it comes from someone who once gave endlessly, spoke gently, and loved deeply. But when an empath finally walks away from narcissistic abuse, silence becomes their first act of true power. It isn't weakness, and it isn't surrender. It's the moment the empath decides, consciously or unconsciously, to stop pouring their energy into a black hole that only took and never gave back. For so long, their voice belonged to someone else's narrative. Their emotions were managed, controlled, dismissed, or twisted. Their reactions fed the narcissist. Their explanations kept the cycle alive. Their compassion became the fuel that allowed the narcissist to feel powerful. And then one day, something inside breaks, or rather, something inside awakens. The empath realizes they no longer owe their voice to someone who never heard it, their time to someone who never valued it, their heart to someone who only took advantage of it. Silence becomes the boundary they were never allowed to set. It becomes the shield that protects whatever pieces of themselves they still have left. In that silence, the empath begins to reclaim their soul, the parts of it that were dimmed, ignored, or stolen. Silence is the empath's first chapter of freedom, the moment they take back control, not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through complete disengagement. It is the loudest message they will ever send: you no longer have access to me. And while outsiders may interpret it as shutting down, withdrawing, or giving up, the empath knows the truth. Silence is their sanctuary, their reset, their way of saying, I am choosing myself now. It is the most powerful step they take on their path to healing, because it is the first step that belongs entirely to them. And once that silence begins, once the empath finally stops offering their voice to someone who only ever misused it, they naturally turn inward and toward the one place that has always held the power to restore them: home. After so much emotional chaos, home becomes more than walls and rooms. It becomes the first safe place where the empath can breathe without fear, reflect without interruption, and exist without being drained. Staying home is not avoidance, it is recovery. It is the moment the empath steps into an environment where nothing demands from them, nothing manipulates their emotions, and nothing distorts their reality. The home becomes the sanctuary, where their nervous system can slowly settle after being stretched to exhaustion by hypervigilance and constant psychological pressure. In that quiet space, they don't have to pretend to be okay or hold themselves together for anyone else's comfort. They can let their body shake, let their thoughts spill out, let their heart feel whatever rises. For perhaps the first time in years, they begin reconnecting with themselves in the most honest way possible. The empath stays home because the world outside feels too loud, too sharp, too heavy after surviving someone who made even simple interactions feel like walking through fire. Home becomes the place where the empath can gather strength without judgment, where stillness becomes medicine, where solitude becomes clarity. And as they sit in the softness of their own space, they start to rebuild emotional foundations the narcissist cracked. They begin to notice their own needs, their own rhythms, their own truth resurfacing. Staying home is how the empath starts nurturing the parts of themselves that were starved. It is where silence transforms into grounding, where solitude becomes healing, and where the first real steps toward reclaiming their life quietly take shape. And as the empath settles into that sanctuary of silence and stillness, something even deeper begins to unfold. Something that goes far beyond simply resting or recovering. In the quiet of their own home, away from the noise, the pressure, and the emotional distortion of the narcissist, the empath starts rediscovering who they are without manipulation shaping their every step. For so long, their identity was filtered through someone else's moods, demands, and expectations. They learn to shrink themselves to avoid conflict, to speak softly to prevent anger, to overgive just to feel momentarily valued. Their entire sense of self was slowly rewritten by someone who needed control more than connection. But in the safety of silence, that spell finally breaks. Little by little, the empath begins to hear their own voice again, a voice that had been buried under years of gaslighting, guilt, and psychological exhaustion. They start asking themselves questions they were never allowed to consider. What do I actually want? What feels right to me? Who was I before all this? These questions don't arrive loudly, they rise softly, like echoes returning from a long-lost place within, and with each answer that surfaces, the empath pieces together a part of themselves they hadn't realized was missing. This rediscovery isn't dramatic. It's gentle, subtle, almost sacred. It happens in quiet mornings, in slow breaths, in moments when they realize they no longer have to brace themselves for emotional impact. The empath begins to understand they were never created to live in survival mode. They were never meant to be drained by someone who fed off their kindness. Silence becomes the mirror that shows them their true reflection again. And as they reconnect with our authentic self, the self the narcissist tried so hard to erase, their healing deepens, their clarity returns, and a new chapter of inner strength begins to take form. And as that authentic self slowly begins to reappear, the empath starts to notice something they had ignored for far too long: the fractures within. Narcissistic abuse doesn't just exhaust a person, it shatters them in places that were never meant to break. Identity, confidence, intuition, self-worth. Pieces of these core parts splinter under constant psychological pressure. But it's in the quiet of their rediscovery that the empath finally sees the truth of their own internal landscape. Not to judge it, not to fear it, but to understand it, and that understanding is the beginning of healing. For years, the empath's sense of identity was subtly rewritten by someone who thrived on control. They doubted their feelings, questioned their perceptions, apologized for their existence. Every manipulation chipped away at who they believed themselves to be until they no longer recognized their own emotional shape. But now, in silence, those broken pieces rise to the surface with honesty they were never allowed to express. And instead of collapsing under the weight of this awareness, the empath begins to gently gather each piece with compassion. This is where silence becomes more than rest. It becomes reconstruction. Each quiet moment acts like a tiny thread stitching the self back together. Every realization, every released tear, every breath of relief becomes part of the glue that restores what was once wounded. And although the empath may feel fragile during this process, they are not weak. They are rebuilding from the inside out. They are reclaiming the parts of themselves that were chipped away, stolen, or silenced. What once felt like emptiness now becomes the space where healing happens. And in that space, the empath discovers that wholeness is not about returning to who they were before the abuse. It's about becoming someone even stronger, wiser, and more conscious than they ever imagined themselves to be. And as those pieces slowly come back together, something powerful and unexpected begins to rise inside the empath. Something the narcissist never anticipated. The moment the empath starts rebuilding their identity, their silence transforms into a quiet rebellion. It becomes the first true act of refusal. The moment they stop feeding the narcissist's ego with their reactions, their explanations, their apologies, or their emotional labor. For so long, the narcissist relied on the empath's constant engagement. Whether it was defending themselves, calming the narcissist's anger, or trying to fix what they didn't break, the empath's energy was the fuel that kept the entire toxic system alive. But when the empath goes silent, that fuel is gone. And the beauty is, the empath doesn't go silent to punish anyone or to play games. They go silent because they finally understand the power of not participating. It is the point where they choose peace over chaos, clarity over confusion, and self-respect over emotional survival. Silence is the empath's way of saying, I reject this cycle, without uttering a single word. It is their way of stepping out of the role the narcissist tried so hard to force them into. This withdrawal is not passive, it is profoundly active. It is the moment the empath stops dancing to a tune that was never theirs. Their absence becomes louder than any argument they could ever make. Their disengagement becomes a declaration of autonomy. And in that declaration, their inner strength crystallizes. They realize they don't need to explain themselves to someone committed to misunderstanding them. They don't need to prove their worth to someone who only valued their compliance. They don't need to fix a relationship that was built on emotional extraction. In choosing silence, the empath chooses themselves. And that choice, quiet, steady, unwavering, is the very thing that begins to undo the narcissist's illusion of control. It is the moment the empath steps into their own power, not with noise, but with undeniable self-respect. And once the empath chooses themselves through silence, something remarkable begins to shift inside them. The isolation that others might misinterpret as loneliness becomes something entirely different, something sacred. It becomes restoration. After years of pouring every drop of emotional energy into someone who only took, the empath's soul finally has room to breathe again. What looks like staying home, withdrawing, or shutting people out is actually the beginning of emotional detox. It's the clearing away of the narcissist's residue, the releasing of old patterns, the quiet rewiring of a heart that has been stretched far beyond its limits. You see, when the empath stops feeding the narcissist's ego, they confront a truth they had ignored for far too long. Their own inner world is depleted. Their mind has been overstimulated by chaos. Their emotions have been twisted by manipulation. Their intuition has been smothered by constant self-doubt. So they lean into solitude, not because they want to avoid life, but because they need to learn how to live again. Alone, they can finally feel what's real without being told what to think. Alone, they can cry without shame, breathe without fear, reflect without judgment. This isolation becomes a form of recalibration. It gives the empath space to understand what drained them, what broke them, and what boundaries they must build to protect themselves in the future. It's where their damaged emotional circuitry starts to repair itself. Bit by bit, peace returns. Bit by bit, clarity sharpens. Bit by bit, their inner strength, once suppressed, begins to rise. And in this quiet restoration, the empath discovers something profoundly healing. Solitude doesn't hurt, it heals. It doesn't empty them, it restores them. Isolation becomes the chrysalis where transformation begins, where exhaustion turns into awakening, and where the empath slowly becomes someone the narcissist never expected. A person who is finally whole enough to live life on their own terms, and as that restoration deepens, something the empath had been ignoring for years finally comes into full awareness. Their nervous system is exhausted, overstimulated, and desperate for stillness. Narcissistic abuse is not just emotional, it is neurological. It forces the body into a constant state of alert, where every sound feels threatening, every silence feels suspicious, and every interaction requires emotional calculation. The empath lived in survival mode for so long that their body forgot what safety felt like. So when they withdraw into solitude, they are not just seeking peace for their mind. They are allowing their nervous system to reset. In the quiet, their heartbeat finally slows. Their breathing evens out. Their muscles loosen. The tension they carried for years begins to melt in the absence of chaos. This stillness becomes a sanctuary not just for the soul, but for the physical body that has been carrying the invisible weight of emotional warfare. For the first time in far too long, the empath is no longer preparing for impact. They are no longer anticipating the next outburst, the next manipulation, the next shift in mood. Their body finally receives the message, "You are safe now." This is why they avoid social noise, crowded rooms, and overwhelming interactions. Their system can't handle more stimulation. Healing requires slowness. Their spirit needs the softness of quiet mornings, gentle routines, and familiar spaces. Every simple act, making tea, sitting by a window, wrapping themselves in a blanket, becomes part of the process of regulating a nervous system that was pushed past its limits. In this stillness, they begin to release the hypervigilance they once mistook for intuition. Their body starts trusting again, their mind starts clearing, their heart starts settling, and with every day spent in quiet, their nervous system softens out of survival mode and returns to a space of calm, presence, and balance. It is in this deep, needed stillness that true healing finally becomes possible. And once their nervous system finally begins to soften out of survival mode, something almost miraculous happens. Something the empath didn't even realize they had lost. In the quiet, in the stillness, in the gentle rhythm of days where nobody is demanding anything from them, the empath begins to hear their inner voice again. Not the voice shaped by fear, not the voice molded by manipulation, not the voice trained to anticipate someone else's reactions, but their true inner voice, the one that had been buried beneath years of chaos and emotional overload. At first it comes as a whisper, subtle and uncertain, like a faint echo returning after a long absence. But as the empath settles deeper into their healing space, the whisper grows clearer. Because when the body feels safe and the mind is no longer defending itself, intuition rises back to the surface. The empath starts recognizing the difference between genuine instinct and trauma-trained vigilance. They begin to trust their perceptions again. They notice what feels good and what doesn't. They sense what aligns with their spirit and what drains their energy. They rediscover preferences, boundaries, dreams, and desires that were once overshadowed by the narcissist's demands. And with each passing day spent in solitude, that inner guidance becomes stronger, more confident, more honest. This voice had been silenced, criticized, and overwritten for so long that hearing it again feels like reconnecting with an old friend. It reminds them of who they are, what they deserve, and where they are meant to go next. It becomes the compass that helps them navigate out of confusion and back into clarity. And as they listen to it, truly listen, they start making choices not out of fear, but out of self-respect. They begin to feel aligned with themselves in ways they hadn't felt in years. In that quiet connection with their inner voice, the empath discovers the deepest truth of their healing. The narcissist never destroyed their intuition. It was only waiting for silence to speak again. And as that inner voice grows stronger, guiding them with a clarity they once thought they'd lost forever, the empath begins to enter a phase of healing that feels both tender and transformative. The silence that once felt unfamiliar now feels sacred. The solitude that once felt heavy now feels purposeful. Their home, this quiet, protected space, slowly turns into more than just a refuge. It becomes the birthplace of their rebirth. Because after everything they have endured, the empath realizes they cannot rebuild themselves in the same environment where they were broken. They cannot become whole in spaces filled with noise, judgment, or emotional demands. They need a sanctuary for their spiritual reconstruction, a place where their intuition can grow roots again. This is why they stay home, why they avoid social interaction, why they guard their energy so fiercely. Healing after narcissistic abuse is not a quick process. It is a deep internal unfolding that requires gentleness, patience, and protection. The empath begins to understand that they are not merely recovering from a relationship, they are rediscovering the architecture of their own soul. They are learning themselves anew, finding out what peace feels like, what authenticity sounds like, and what emotional safety truly means. In this sacred chapter, small routines become rituals of renewal. Moments of quiet reflection become moments of revelation. The empath starts creating a life that aligns with their truth, not the distorted version of themselves they were forced to adopt. Their home becomes the cocoon where transformation gathers strength. They declutter not just physical spaces, but emotional ones. They detach from old habits of overgiving, overexplaining, and overextending. They learn the beauty of saying no, the power of emotional boundaries, and the freedom of not carrying the weight of others. Staying home becomes a journey back into themselves, a return to the person they were before the confusion, before the manipulation, before the erosion of self. It's here, in this quiet sanctuary, that they begin to see glimpses of the person they are becoming, wiser, clearer, grounded, and fiercely self-aware. They start to view the world not through the lens of trauma, but through the lens of possibility. This private rebirth is slow, intentional, and deeply powerful. It's the transformation the narcissist never imagined could happen. And in this quiet, sacred rebuilding, the empath is not hiding. They are rising. They are preparing to re-enter the world as someone stronger, someone awakened, someone who finally knows their worth and refuses to let anyone dim it again. And as this rebirth unfolds behind closed doors and within the quiet corners of their soul, something even more extraordinary begins to take shape. The empath starts to feel a strength they never realized they possessed, a strength that wasn't built in the storm, but in the stillness that followed it. This is where the 10th transformation takes place. The moment the empath realizes that when they finally step back into the world, they will not return as the same person who once tolerated the narcissist's chaos. They emerge wiser, more grounded, and with a level of self-respect so deeply anchored that it becomes unshakable. During their time alone, they learn truths that change everything. They learn that peace is not optional, it is essential. They learn that their energy is precious and must be protected. They learn that boundaries are not walls, they are doors that only open for those deserving of entry. They learn that love is not something they must earn through suffering, and that the right people will never require them to shrink, silence themselves, or sacrifice their sanity. These realizations build a foundation of inner power that the narcissist could never destroy, no matter how hard they tried. And so, when the empath finally rises from their sanctuary and steps into the world again, they walk with a new kind of presence. A presence shaped by clarity, not confusion, strength, not fragility, awareness, not self-doubt. They no longer tolerate what drains them, no longer chase what wounds them, and no longer explain themselves to those committed to misunderstanding them. They move with intention. They choose with discernment. They connect with people who honor their heart instead of exploiting it. Their silence has sharpened their intuition. Their solitude has refined their values. Their healing has expanded their resilience. They are no longer afraid of losing people. They are afraid of losing themselves again. And that shift changes everything. It transforms the empath from someone who once absorbed pain into someone who now radiates truth, someone who once feared abandonment into someone who now embraces freedom, someone who once questioned their worth into someone who now embodies it. This is the empath's quiet, powerful awakening. They do not seek revenge. They do not return to prove anything. They simply rise. And in that rise, they become the one thing the narcissist never prepared for. A person who knows their value so completely that no one can ever take it from them again. And so when we talk about why empaths go silent and stay home after narcissistic abuse, we are not talking about isolation or weakness or withdrawal. We're talking about rebirth. We're talking about a human being who walked through emotional fire and finally found the courage to step out of it. Their silence is not the end of their story. It's the beginning of the chapter where they become who they were always meant to be. Because in that silence, they heal the wounds no one could see. In that stillness, they rebuild the parts of themselves they once believed were lost. In that solitude, they rediscover their voice, their intuition, and their strength. And by the time they rise again, they are no longer the fragile soul the narcissist tried to break. They are someone wiser, someone braver, someone more self-aware than they ever imagined. If you are an empath listening to this, understand. And this truth, your quiet is powerful. Your healing is sacred. Your journey does not need to look loud or fast or dramatic to be real. Every moment you spend choosing yourself, whether it's sitting in silence, protecting your peace, or simply breathing without fear, is a step toward the life you truly deserve. One day you will look back at this season of stillness and realize it was not a pause in your life. It was a turning point. The moment you shifted from surviving to rising, the moment you stopped shrinking and started becoming. And when you finally step into the world again, you won't walk, you will shine. The kind of shine that comes from a healed spirit, a steady heart, and a soul that finally remembers its own worth. Stay patient with your process. Stay gentle with your heart. Your silence is not your ending. It is your awakening.